The work order said Sub-Level 4, Vault 9, Routine Audit, Decommissioned Server Block, Flagged for Eventual Demolition. Nobody had been down there in 3 years. I took the job because the environmental log showed an unresolved humidity spike that maintenance had been kicking forward since the last fiscal cycle, and nobody else wanted the walk. 22 years at Calith Transit Hub had taught me that the jobs nobody wanted were the ones that told you the truth about a place. I took the stairs. The sub-level smelled of recycled air and old insulation compound. That chemical sweetness synthetic fiber gives off when it ages in a sealed space. My lamp threw a cone of yellow light down a corridor that hadn't seen foot traffic in years. Dust had settled in the grout lines of the deck plating. The humidity spike showed on my reader as a faint amber warning. Moisture accumulation, consistent with an active thermal source, not a pipe fault. Active thermal source meant something was running down here. Something warm. I found Vault 9 at the end of the corridor and keyed the panel with my maintenance override. The door unsealed with a pressure sigh, and the smell changed. Cooler, cleaner, the faint ozone tang of live electronics. The amber warning on my reader climbed to orange. Inside, the server racks stood in 2 rows, most dark and dead, but the far rack was lit. Soft blue indicator lights, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. A low hum that I felt more in my chest than heard with my ears. And in the center of that rack, seated on a padded platform that someone had bolted directly to the server chassis, was a child. She was small, gray-skinned, the color of old pewter, with a delicate ridge of cartilage running from her brow to the back of her skull. Her clothing was simple, a sleeveless tunic, pale, worn thin at the shoulders. A neural feed collar sat against her neck. Matte black, 6 ports, a thin fiber bundle running from each port into the rack behind her. Her eyes were open. They were amber, very large, and they were looking directly at me. I did not call for help. I did not reach for my communicator. I sat down on the deck in front of her, set my lamp beside me so the light was soft and not in her face, and I looked at her, the way you look at something that needs to understand you are not a threat. She watched me without moving. Her breathing was slow. Her hands rested in her lap, and after a long moment, maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3, she extended one hand toward me, palm up, fingers loosely open. I put my hand in hers. She closed her fingers around 2 of mine. That was how I found out what they had done to her. It took me another hour to understand the full shape of it. The vault's local terminal was unlocked. Sloppy, or arrogant, or both. And I read what it held with the child's hand still in mine. Calith Transit Hub ran a subscription memory service. Passengers could purchase experiential memory content through the hub's entertainment network. Not recordings, not simulations, but synthesized emotional signal, the feeling of a homecoming, a reunion, a parent's recognition, premium content, licensed to medical facilities and grief processing centers across 6-star systems. The signal had to come from somewhere. Synthesized was a marketing word. What the network actually ran was a live feed, harvested from a biological source, whose neurological output was rich enough and stable enough to sustain a high-fidelity emotional carrier wave, the child. She had been here, wired into this rack, for 11 months. The feed ran 14 hours a day. The collar modulated her output without her conscious direction. It reached into whatever she carried naturally, the warmth and the longing, and the particular human-adjacent emotional register that her species produced in abundance. And it packaged that and sold it across the network to people who needed to feel something they had lost. They had been selling her feeling. They had been selling the inside of her. I sat with that. The hum of the rack, the child's fingers around mine. Then I let go of her hand, told her with a slow open palm gesture that I would be right back, and I went to work. 22 years of maintenance at Calith meant I knew this station the way you know the inside of your own chest. The routing paths, the load architecture, the places where 2 systems shared a common junction that was never meant to carry the weight of both. Sublevel 4 sat directly beneath the hub's primary distribution node for the entertainment network. The synthesis feed ran on a dedicated fiber channel, but that channel drew its power through the same conduit cluster as the transit concourse's environmental grid, an old integration from a refit that had been done cheap and fast, and that nobody had ever corrected, because it worked fine as long as you didn't stress both systems simultaneously. I knew how to stress both systems simultaneously. I pulled the maintenance panel on the far wall and found the conduit cluster where the synthesis feed tapped in. I didn't cut anything. Cutting would trigger an immediate alarm. Instead, I introduced a calibrated load imbalance into the environmental grid, something I could do with the adjustment tool I carried for HVAC balancing. Nothing exotic. And then I waited. The imbalance would propagate slowly, invisibly, through the shared junction, building thermal stress in the synthesis feed's power regulation module. Not an explosion. A quiet failure, the kind that looked like equipment age. It would brick every synthesis node on the network from the inside out, and it would take the subscriber registry with it when it went, because the registry was stored in the same volatile memory stack as the active session data, and a hard power fault to the regulation module would clear that stack entirely. It would take about 40 minutes. I went back and sat with the child. I did not try to remove the collar myself. I did not know enough about the port architecture to be certain I could do it safely, and I was not going to risk her on my certainty. What I did was look at the collar's release panel. It had one, a simple mechanical backup, the kind that regulators required on any device with a biological interface, and confirmed that it was there, and that I could open it when the power failed, because the fail state of a mechanical backup is always open. The moment the rack lost power, the collar would release. So I sat with her, and she sat with me. She had stopped watching me with the careful stillness of an animal assessing a predator. Now she watched me the way a child watches someone who is doing something they do not fully understand, but have decided to trust. At some point she leaned her shoulder against my arm. I did not move. The fault cascaded at 37 minutes. The rack's indicators went dark in a ripple from left to right, and the hum died, and in the sudden quiet, the collar released with a soft mechanical click and fell forward into the child's lap. She picked it up and looked at it. Then she set it on the deck beside her, carefully, as if it were something that required respect even in its discarding. I took off my maintenance jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was large enough to cover her to the knees. I shouldered my kit, picked up the lamp, and held out my hand. She took it. The forgotten corridor was behind a utility access panel on the north wall of the sublevel, a service route from the original station build that had been sealed off during a refurbishment and never reopened, because it emerged at the transit concourse level through a utility closet that now sat behind the maintenance staff offices. I had used it twice in 22 years, once when a corridor flood had sealed the main routes, and once when I simply could not face another transit commute. I knew it was there. Nobody else did. We came up through the utility closet and into the maintenance office corridor at 0340 station time. The concourse was quiet. The overnight skeleton staff concentrated at the far end near arrivals. I walked us to the duty officer's station, set down my kit, and asked the night supervisor for the dependent registration forms. He looked at me. He looked at the child in my maintenance jacket. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he opened the form. I filed her under my maintenance residency papers as a dependent. It took 11 minutes. The forms were processed and time-stamped before the station's network operations team had even confirmed that the synthesis feed was offline. By the time the corporate managers started asking questions, the question of where she was had a legal answer on file, and that answer had a timestamp, and the timestamp predated every inquiry they ever sent. They terminated my maintenance contract 6 weeks later. Conduct incompatible with operational standards. I accepted the termination letter, printed it, and used it to wrap the carving she had made for me out of a piece of scrap insulation board, a small figure, rough-edged, recognizable only if you knew what you were looking for. I knew what I was looking for, I had known since she put her hand in mine on the floor of Vault 9. Some things you cannot sell. You can try, and for 11 months nobody stopped you. And then one day, a maintenance tech comes down for a routine audit and sits on the floor in front of what you have done. I do not miss the job. I have never missed the job.